Hello. Let's see. Are we good? No. Yep. That seems good. Okay. So now that we've got that proven, we are live. So let me just notify. And also to my first subscriber. Okay. Where are we? Let's see if we can see. You probably actually can't really see that very well. So what did we get to? We got to, because this is our key focus, is sort of using the contemplations on Plato, the Republic, to sort of build the structure on which we can assess the framework of how systems should be developed, essentially, even the systems of the individual. How far. Well, first we're seeing what is what through the framework of the Republic is considered the bounds of an individual, or a system, and which is the government, which makes something we should probably think on, because there is probably a strata of what should be considered, depending on the responsibility or authority. That's probably something to be put there. I guess that's how much we put into this. But yeah, anyway, how much responsibility each of these parts has probably determines, that's somewhat of its, actions, to say the least. And this is sort of talking mainly about a responsibility is in the world. We have to decide where we put our responsibility for different parts of life. Like the individual. When is the individual responsible? When is the system responsible? And then addictive material, which is actually kind of interesting that I just watched a breakdown of different drug policies and the effects upon the population. So that's actually kind of interesting, because mainly what I think of addictive material, it's also influencing material, let's say. So let's say in the framework of like heavy eating or something like that, that is an addictive material, let's say, in the sense of, when someone gets into that position, the amount of food available to them influences that action. And so, can we put the full responsibility on the individual, or is the availability or the prevalence of a full food culture, which is something that is currently tapped into the systems, but I think we should probably pull out of that. There is maybe culture could be considered a system, but we should probably divide it in this sense, because the responsibility, we don't, it is because of the abstract nature of the position in which culture sits, we can't really give it the same amount of responsibility as a government system, let's say. But so where we put the responsibility is what probably should be managed in order to in a negative influence. And this is mainly focusing on negative influences. There is a constitution of what is good and bad for each of these parts. So an individual should probably be fair and not manipulative. So what does that mean? And as a sidetrack, there's something that should be acknowledged is this is all postulation at the moment. And I will come to proofs, I guess, is what I should be doing at some point. But first, let's postulate about the framework upon intuitions and under this examination through the lens of responsibility. And so we can see a world where when people are manipulative, the other parts really can't hold that responsibility. If a person, works for their own gain at the expense of others, which is kind of the key of manipulation, that constitutes an individual that does not work with the whole. But then we come to the system, and if we have a system that is biased to a set of individuals or a culture within it, we, depending on, because they also have to have the bias of order, essentially. So, but that is probably in the framework that they should be looking at of merit. That the government system should reward good behaviors and discourage bad behaviors, because that essentially has a lot of responsibility upon how culture shifts. So and that is also interesting in consideration of Portugal versus saw a video of Portugal versus Oklahoma, I believe, in their drug response laws, and why Portugal's worked better than the other. And a lot of that is government institution impact upon the culture via the look into merit and how to invest in a good structure for reward and condemning, that creates a culture that pulls away from the addictive material, not an sort of oppressive nature in it that pulls away. It's not the government really creating a solid structure, or it itself pulling away the addictive material from the individual due to, well, the government system isn't all places at all times. And so that's something we should. And so the individual can quite easily get to the manipulative material despite the structural influence of the government system. But if the government system creates a culture, I should probably write this down finally. Culture that influences the individual to move away from the addictive material, then we have, a better constitution of stopping that behavior that will bypass the governmental system. So I guess we're already getting into it. So it's interesting to contemplate that chain of events and wonder if that leads to a hierarchy, essentially, of events that if that is something that worked, should we say that I need to make sure this pen stays up. Government should lead to culture. Should lead to individual. Over addictive substance. And so this is something to consider. Of a lot of this was talking about methamphetamines as opposed to other maybe more addictive substances. I'm not sure. I actually don't know the hierarchy of addictive substances, but in the research surrounding that, it seemed to be that the individual circumstances really impacted how much they were influenced by the addictive material more than the addictive material was influencing them. And so the government system creating, it was the system that Portugal had was the government system created a board, a health board, that would the individuals caught with drugs would go to, unless it was in a production manner or distribution, then they would go to the legal system. So that for one is interesting, because then that is the government enforcing itself. The government is enforcing that action, and so that can be the right path in some situations. So that's interesting to consider if we're creating a framework, that if it's not something that really, if it's not something that can be, the responsibility is on or the key crux is the individual's environment or life at the moment, then this is probably the best path. But if it is, which I guess is inward destructively, this is the best path, as opposed to outwardly destructive. So that's sorry, all on the other side. Which is interesting to consider with some other stuff that I won't go into. It's quite fortunate. So that's an interesting chain of events. And with that, it's interesting to consider that the responsibility is never really on the drugs in that sense. Even in both cases, whether it's the inward destructive, where it's individual using, the responsibility is sort of put on immaterial situations. But if they are dealing, then it is a individual responsibility. The justice system is the government over the individual, essentially, and the government enforcing the responsibility that the individual should have. So, I guess with that, let me just see how probably it's a little bit further in if I'm going to be speaking this way mostly. Sorry about that. And it's interesting to think about where that is the individual case is individual destruction is situated with responsibility. It seems to be nowhere in a sense. It seems like the government puts the responsibility on the individual to solve the problem, but I believe unless the individual doesn't actually show up to the board meeting, the government, if they do not show up, then the government gets involved and says, you did not go to a government instigated meeting. So, we required you to be here. You went there, so you've fallen foul of the law. So, and it's interesting also now thinking that the government systems, I was originally talking about justice, law justice, and using wider good to not equal law justice as shown in Plato's, is kind of equated in Plato's Republic. Plato, the main character in the Republic, seems to get the people questioning him about his questionings. Essentially, there's not really a solid. There's the question brought up of, is justice just what the strong impose upon the weak, essentially? What the government institutes upon the people? And so there's very much ways that the main character questions that thing using the imperative of the intuition of a wider good, of what people would feel about that, and equating that to justice, but I don't think that's true. And so it's interesting to consider that wider good is probably make sure dog is visible. the wider good is probably more constituted in the individual's feelings, the groups of individuals, or the culture, the individual, the connection there. And justice is more probably the connection between culture and government systems. So that's interesting to think that now that we've added culture there, these things now sit sort of between these institutions, let's say. They kind of share the buck of it, essentially. So, where does that? So, it's actually, this is responsibility management, or places in which we can actually put our focus. And the wider good or justice is sort of the place between them and the influencing factors. So that's interesting to consider, because then the relationship between the individual and the addictive substance is sort of where the behavior that needs to get managed by, if it is by another system, by another locus of being, essentially, that the action between them is what's trying to be mitigated by the impact upon a point, essentially. So that is probably something interesting to consider. And it's interesting also to consider that is individual influencing individual, I guess the manipulative factor, is that located within the individual, or is it a relationship with individuals? Essentially, well, I guess we can, if we're talking about individuals, there is multiple. We aren't, encompassing all individuals into one point. So that is still a relation line, as opposed to a factor within that structure. And so, sort of, it is also true of culture that when there is any sort of friction, or when there's any sort of friction, it is between different cultures. But this is interesting when you talk about the influence of that culture. I guess the influence is down upon the individual. But this is where we must see how we constitute culture in a purely positive, or a more positive, what I would consider to be the positive virtue in the culture versus negative. So this is one that is a lot more vague than the others, I would say. And this is probably where different governments through the world have a tighter relationship to culture or not. Oh no, I can't have dog and full whiteboard. So we'll have to have dog. So because that is interesting to consider. And in a way, these culture and systems gets confused and intertangled quite often in the world, because the government systems, the values or things that it enforces, is built by the people inside it, which are all influenced by the culture of what is seen as right within the community, which is odd. Well, it's not odd, it's pretty commonplace, but important to consider the shifting nature of that, essentially. Okay. Now, addictive material, it's interesting to consider what would the positive aspect of that be? Because that, it seems to get a negative light in a sense. But you could say habitual material or habit forming. Because that is a change, though, because addiction is a different thing to a habit, as quite plain to the ear. That addiction is described by a dependency or a negative impact based upon a sort of relationship that is negative. And so that is interesting to consider when we talked about that fragment before, that this is a locus, not a relationship. And so addiction is actually a relationship more than locus. So that is the relationship to whatever this is, whatever addictive material I have classified is. So that should really be renamed. And now this makes me think biology as a sense, which is something I'll have to consider and probably end up having to come back to next time, in fact. So let's just keep that as a question mark. I will and go back to culture, because I think that's probably a lot more intuitive than what we should call the locus that influences people, of materials that sort of influence people, because it's quite easy to see that that material is also immaterial in a way. Well, it probably is just material, isn't it? If we are talking about stuff that's more immaterial, it's more of the relationship between individuals, essentially, like a relationship or addiction to a material or utilization of a material. And to that end, it's pretty hard to see whether the material is good or bad. Like, if we consider asbestos is, evil according to, health standards and stuff like that. That is one of the best insulating factors and most versatile materials. And so, you can make clothing, you can make cloths and insulation and very many things out of asbestos that had, that is why it's kept around and why probably the health impacts were dulled down a bit. So, and depending on the use of it, like if you put it in somewhere that will never be touched, that is impacted, like, but that's pretty hard to say, isn't it? Through the course of a building, let's say, because that seems like the most structural or consistent and not touched item in that people make, that even then, buildings get destructed and replaced as time moves on. This is an old 60s house, as you can probably tell by sort of structure of windowsills and stuff like that. It probably could do with being replaced. There's a whole lot of renovation that could be done, but is this really what is constituted as a fitting house in these sort of standards? The rooms are great, the sizing and stuff like that, but the integrity of the house is, in bones wise, is very good, but the fleshings has been worn essentially. And in a way, if this is part of what is constituted as being part of the 60s house, if it was stripped and rebuilt, or recladded, rejibbed and all that, it would not be the same thing. And so that's interesting to consider. It probably might not be considered 60s. And that was a sidetrack, wasn't it? Anyway, that was talking about material. And so quite easily the individual's imperative would probably be to retouch pretty much this whole structure, even though it's sort of meant to be permanent, a solid structure that services the people living in it. And so material, yeah, asbestos is probably not a good material, even in the situation of thinking of that this will never be really moved or touched. And maybe you could maybe consider monuments to be more fitting for that. That something with historical precedents do not be touched, that this building does not have, that people's feelings about how a house should look will change over time, but the Arc de Triomphe or the White House. I guess the White House does get pretty remodeled, especially the Oval Chamber, which has sometimes not been oval, I think. As every president pretty much remodels it now. But the Washington Monument probably should stick around and stuff like that. But, we'll see. We'll see what happens with all that. But so we should maybe then consider we'll rename this material. And then in doing that, and it now talks about asbestos and stuff like that, it is not the material itself that is constituted in one way or another. It does not own the responsibility of that. It is really on the individual entities within a culture, like a business or so, that makes me think about fair and manipulative, but it is the individual entities that manipulate materials. So, and various materials can be seen in different ways to be valuable or not. And in that sense, we have nuclear materials that are unstable and not good for even being around people because that causes cancer and all that. But nuclear power plants can utilize that. Nuclear weapons also is probably the opposite way of utilizing that. Um, but that is interesting to consider. Material in a passive state, does that have any sort of constitution responsibility upon it? I guess you could say that it's really upon the individuals to constitute themselves around the materials, which seems important to know. Um, like, you can't really blame a nuclear rock from being underneath a certain person's house. It's up to the individual person to not build it there, or even it being in a certain part of the woods. It's upon the people to know whether to go there or not. And so we can say that material is neutral. But relations aren't, essentially. So that really ups the complexity of our system, is this sort of nodes and relationships model. So relationships aren't neutral. Well, they can be, so do I really want to write necessarily? Necessarily. Or so relationships hold the responsibility. Hold as the responsibility. So the relationships is what really is where the virtue lies, essentially. Virtue or vice, as holding the dichotomy underneath the virtue for lack of value or whatever. That's an interesting, because vice seems to be an indulgence, essentially. Something that you are getting something out of it at the expense of it, essentially. There's some sort of thing that's wrong about vice that that is hurting others or yourself, essentially. And so with that, it's interesting to consider negligent actions, essentially. And now it's something upon the same sort of framework as like the 7 deadly sins, let's say. That these is something that you could quite easily see in sloth as negligence or something like that. So with that consideration, are the 7 deadly sins just vices, essentially? Is the vice relationship of the 7 deadly sin, is that a one-to-one, or is that a sort of, or is negligence kind of pull it away from being that? Because it seems as though to me that vices are sort of things or not even necessarily know, things that you're doing the detriment to yourself for the enjoyment of yourself. Whereas there is no sort of, I guess you could say there is a virtue in sort of ignoring something does have a positive influence in your life. It's something that you might enjoy doing, of not having to think about such things. That you might not want to consider or spend your time thinking about whether that relationship, whether using your time and energy, essentially, because time is also energy to a person, that choosing not to is choosing to use your energy elsewhere, essentially. And that's so where negligence kind of sits, and that's sort of a pseudo knowing negligence, I think you should say. And that's and so under that, it's kind of the same as the vices, essentially, that you are choosing to constitute your energies elsewhere for that benefit. You're choosing to benefit yourself in one way and detriment in another. And yeah, there's many ways in which that is similar into the more standard seen vices. But our individualistic culture that has not a lot of weight upon responsibility for your relationships to others, this sort of positive rights model that as an individual you are given the rights to do things, as opposed to the negative rights model of that it's the right that the government can't do something to you, essentially, or other people can't do something to you because that violates your free will. And so I guess I was wrong before. It's more of a stronger version of negative rights, of the sort of pulling into the sense that not even your responsibility to others, or that should never be considered, your responsibility to others, or the responsibility to not damage the things around you, or not be negligent of them. That with negative rights you can kind of hit into the vice of negligence. But positive rights, does that have the same problem, actually? That if you're given all these things, you're not really encompassed, it's not really put upon you to actually do anything for anyone. Well, except for those that need to supply what is needed for your rights. Because with positive rights, the government systems, which is staffed by people, need to do things in order to give you your rights. They need to service healthcare, or stuff like that. And so this is where negative rights usually puts that into privileges, that the government gives you this privilege of that, or earning your way to food is a privilege. Not everyone has to be a farmer is kind of a privilege, that you can do what you think your skills lend you to in order to provide for yourself and others. That is a privilege of the society that we have, that you being in the woods alone do not have. That you have to provide the food, build the food from scratch, essentially. So that's a privilege as opposed to a right in the negative right sense. And so with that, kind of pulls that vices into it, that negligence will not give you will not give you anything. You will lose through negligence in a negative rights model. That if you do not work for food, then you will not get food. If you're not negligent of the stuff that you need, you will not. If you are negligent of the stuff that you need, you will not get the stuff that you need. So that gives the responsibility to the person. But the positive rights model, a lot of that stuff is then put into something that's responsibility of the government to provide for you. That you do not need to lift a finger in order to be fed. You do not need to. You don't need to do anything for any of your needs. And so with that, negligence is fine. You can be as negligent as you want. You can ignore all safety signs. You can do whatever you want, and it's the government's responsibility to look after you if something goes wrong, or even look after you while it's happening. So that's interesting to consider. And so that's where negligence gets pulled away from vice. And so let's look at that vice. Let's put it back on there. Because is that fair? Is that okay that the government essentially runs your life? That the government provides no cultural motivation, essentially. See, with the negative rights model, it is given freedom. A lot of life is still in culture and the individual, and the freedom is given to culture to structure a world or stuff like that. Whereas the positive rights model, the system of the government kind of constitutes what can actually be given to people. That what that needs in order to provide for the individual is supreme, essentially. That, if enough people are starting to get negligent, the government institution can't allow that. They need doctors to service those people. So in a hypothetical situation where the whole population decides to be negligent, the government needs to force them to do the stuff so that it can provide its obligation to the people through rights, and essentially enslave them. What government knows you well enough to know which people should be doctors, essentially. Especially if they're all totally negligent, they're not going to do any sort of standardized testing. And it's quite easy to see with the success rates of doctor training that not everyone's cut out to be a doctor. Not everyone has the big structure in them to be that diligent to get to the finish line of being a doctor and have the responsibilities there and with, or have the ability to learn fast enough of the changing nature of being a doctor, and sort of the relationship. This is interesting to consider. So something that I was looking at before was skill versus IQ. That skill is sort of this built this area of knowledge, in sort of practical knowledge of actually how to do something. And IQ is how fast you can adapt that. And this is sort of built in this if we finally get back to Plato the Republic, he puts another false equation of justice and skill. That that in the questioning of whether the just citizen is the best citizen, it goes through, if you want to sell a horse, who would you rather have, just a just man or someone who actually knows things about horses? If you're going to, have someone with you to buy or sell a horse, you'd want someone who knows something about the institute of that area. And so with that, he kind of makes this false dichotomy that, well, there is a dichotomy, but a false dichotomy that the just citizen is not good in that situation. Where, there's probably going to be a whole lot of people who are good with horses, and the best person, if not just, you would not consider for that part, unless they're going to be biased towards you, I guess, which in their sort of framework is what justice is to be, good to your friends and bad to your enemies. Very weird and, well, weird to our intuition sort of framework of sort of law justice, but wider good, maybe that's where that kind of comes in, that someone who kind of looking out for your good is someone also within that framework of knowledge that you want, as opposed to someone, that just knows a lot, but is kind of trying to scam you at the same time. So that is the false equation of skill and justice. But if we look at skill and IQ, that's sort of a IQ is sort of a virtue in the same way that justice is, that in a changing environment, in a assessing of your environment, like a doctor, where someone problems come to them and they need to assess what that is. That is more a assessing the problem situation than I guess there's some sort of skill framework of knowing the paths in which this sort of problem should be pushed down to solution. And so that's interesting. But that is not the same as, so there's a dichotomy there though, but like you will need, in a way, a high enough IQ to adapt to the situations that keep springing up, the new problems or the new patients. Patients, that's probably not very correct to say, but the new patients that come up, you need to assess the problems they're having in a timely manner. And so there is more to the assessment that the government should probably consider when applying people to a job than just, oh, it's a person. And so that's something they'll need to know about you in a way. And so that certainly brings up a question: how much did the government know about its people? In a positive rights model, it needs to in order to be available to provide, to utilize the people and to provide what it needs to provide. Oh, pardon me. If, because in a way the incentive structure isn't there, no individual needs to do anything in order to get along, and through that they are not incentivizing that behavior. Whereas the negative rights model, you do need to do stuff in order to get on with your life, and so you are definitely incentivized to do that. You need to do that in a way. It's not just a preference of what you want to do in your life. In the sense of retired people, quite often a lot of them keep working because they would go insane without the work. They would feel lost in a way. But this is interesting to consider that they had a long life of this sort of action, and whether this lostness is their relationship with the work that has kind of become dependent as opposed to sort of relational, more you could say utilitarian an approach that a lot of people might also be like, well, I do this work for money, and essentially I can enjoy. I It is also a sense of time use, so I should probably enjoy it while I do it, and find a place where I enjoy to spend that time. So what do we get to from there? That they may have, it is fair to say through moral intuition theory that those people probably would have gone that way anyway. And so then we would have some sort of people, even in a positive rights model, that would probably still go towards work. But it's sort of a question, and a increasing question, whether the people who would do it for utilitarian reasons mainly and then enjoyment secondary, if the utility of that is gone, what are they going to do for entertainment, whatever they want? And that's not necessarily the work part. But anyway, so that's an interesting thing. I think you would lose a lot of workers, and in a way, for a institution or government and individuals and culture to work together to the best aim, you would want as many hands on deck, in a way that you would want everyone working towards the betterment of the future, no matter what, no matter what area in life they're doing that in. If they're just doing it for, if the people who just will mainly in a positive rights model will be just looking for enjoyment, will they be building? Some ways, enjoying the fruits of other people's labor is quite a time-filling endeavor, especially with enough people. Some people will want to build games and stuff like that. I know I wanted to as a kid. I wanted to be a game developer or a systems manager and sort of that sort of thing. And so, but the fruits of my labor is a lot of materials that can provide that relationship that the individuals are looking for. That if enough people are making games, you have the classic basement dweller, man-child sort of situation that would become somewhat more prevalent. That'd be interesting to consider whether that sort of number has sort of plateaued or is sort of increasing through time. Is it even logarithmic? Well, not logarithmic, exponential in approach. Maybe in the percentage of the population that's doing it. And so this is all the problems with a positive rights model, as opposed to a negative rights model where, you got to do it. Yeah, there is a very much a material incentive to do what you do in order to get to the parts that you enjoy. Even if you don't have a well-constituted work environment, like you don't enjoy your work or stuff like that, you still need to do that work in order to have the investments, the materials, the money, or essentially the capital, in order to invest in your entertainment. So that's the incentive structures there. It seems like a better model for both freedom of the individual and and incentive for the individual, uh, especially when considering the positive rights sort of tendency. If the situation does arise that slothery is sort of comes about by the lack of incentive to act, then, well, what's going to happen? Like, the government still has its responsibilities that it needs to fulfill, so it will need to conscript those people, and probably do it poorly because uh, they do not know better than the individual what their work would, what constitutes their best work, as much. And in that structure, also, the people are also incentivized to lie, and be like, well, if they're all, putting themselves in this position that they're like, oh, yes, I do want to do nothing. If that's the consensus, then they're likely to say, well, I'm not good at anything. All of us are not good at anything. Uh, you know, then you just become a number in a crowd as opposed to someone who's special at anything to be qualified to do something more particularly. And if you say, oh, I'm kind of interested in the medical field, if you are you could end up being the most outstanding person in that field, and so being forced into doing work you didn't really want to. You're just like, it's kind of interesting biology. So that's interesting to consider. Now, so I should probably write that down somewhere. I should probably fix that up. Now, this is where we need to consider, that was mostly a hypothetical. And so we need to construct the null hypothesis of that there is something constituted within people that drive them to act. That there are some people that are uniquely constituted to be driven to move, which seems to be right. But the problem it still arises in a way of proportionality. How many people are on each side? Is that enough? And in a way, our society kind of shows that it kind of isn't. That, in recent times, there's a plummeting of people fulfilling certain works fronts, and that has caused some problems. There's a whole lot more people unsatisfied with their work because there are less people working there. That people sometimes leave because of overwork due to the lack of numbers of people working. And so it kind of hits this feedback model where nobody's really influenced to work because of the lack of people working. And it's actually interesting that this is probably the best time to see that. We've had the lowest amounts, some of the lowest amounts of employment in some areas, and that really has hit into the structure. Now the question does then provide, is that just a matter of decrease in numbers and the decrease of positions not matching that number fast enough? The amount of people hired at a place goes down, but the amount of places to work still stays the same until that falls off. And does that number actually need to be that high? Is there a whole lot of superfluous jobs? In a way, you could most definitely say yes. But in a way also, you could say that is the position in which those people should be working. That a lot of, that's where their uh, skills align to. That's the position they want to be. And so depriving some people of that. Now the question is halves, essentially. As some drop off, then a whole lot of people are at half, where, then you could half the amount of places and everything would turn out right. So, yeah, it could be actually all right that that the most, like, in the amount of industrious people is the amount of people that we need in order to service our population. But in a way, that's implying that the other people are doing absolutely nothing. And in a positive rights model would, essentially communism at this stage would be provided their needs despite them not lifting a finger in any way, which I guess in a negative rights model, sort of capitalism at this stage, a lot of those people can still work and, find fulfillment in that. Like something like this, all the streamers that, it might be fair to say that Asmongold, if not in, if was provided everything he wanted, he wouldn't bother streaming, or might not have at least not have the imperative to start streaming in a way. I guess in a sense he did not start because he not because he was incentivized to do so, but because he was only kind of water crowcraft and wanted to provide some of the information he had. So, and then the success dragged him up from there. And so, in a way, that kind of takes away from that as well. And so, this kind of hits into this crux of positive versus negative rights, and in a way, is heading into communism versus capitalism. And this is also where the sort of midline to negative rights model sort of has sort of butted heads in the more recent past, where the midline model of having the positive rights as pretty much all the positive rights has as being what do you call it? I said it before. Privileges. Like you could maybe even still have communism underneath the privileges model, where not everyone is not everyone is forced to be given the food that they need for the day, but they have the privilege in being in this certain society in order to be given that. We are. You could go more nationalistic route and be like, oh, our society is so great and prosperous that we can give the people what they want without them having to work for it. And then this, hits into the once again, the negative incentive model of work. But then this kind of hits into the thing of negative rights with privileges versus just straight negative rights. Now, I think there should probably be some privileges in the society, in a way, law enforcement is sort of the necessarily privilege that we get based upon our right of life, essentially, that or property, that police is a service that is provided in order to protect that is not necessarily a right. Essentially, that's a privilege of our society that we have police to protect our rights, essentially. But negative rights model would be sort of going into the full anarcho-capitalist, essentially. That, I can start a business, you can't, there's no imperative for you to stop me, essentially. And everything will be all right. I have the right to defend myself if harm should try to come to me. I have the right to not be interfered with my work and such stuff like that. And so in a way, we all live in a privilege negative rights model, essentially. Having police and sort of various government institutions to provide extra care for us is privileges upon a bonus to our negative rights. And so that's interesting to consider that with the recent changing of positive right privileges into positive rights, that is really kind of pushing us into a communistic model as opposed to an incentive model with safety nets, essentially, with help for those that do not have the ability to enforce their own negative rights, essentially. And so that's interesting to consider. And in a way, the privileges sort of framework covers the gaps that the positive rights would complain about the negative rights, essentially. That, and that's probably the difference between social capitalism versus communism, essentially, is whether we can consider these, positive, whether we consider things privileges or positive rights. Now, we never really got to culture. And let's just leave that there. Now, it's interesting to consider which way. So let's just put a tick here. I'm just going to put a tick here and leave that as that. That, if we can keep the incentive structure of negative rights and potentially provide all the positive of positive rights through privileges, then, that seems like the best middle ground, as opposed to no incentive structure and impossible tyranny, or negative rights where those without friends lose all, essentially, in the worst case of negative right. Well, if considered, corruption will be around. You might have the right to life, but that doesn't mean that nobody will try to offend that, and or the right to freedom. And that doesn't mean nobody's going to try to infringe that, so someone's going to have to defend that. And so you need enough people around to try to defend that. And so that's sort of that model, and the negative rights also gives you the freedom to do that. But, not everyone has friends and family, unfortunately. So if violated by another culture or group, essentially, then you are kind of screwed if you do not have enough friends. But with positive rights, you got your tyranny problem. So, yeah, I think privileges plus negative rights. Okay, that's just dreadful. Anyway, let's go back to culture. What is a good culture and what is a bad culture? Could we say insularity is a bad culture? That we can't actually. That's interesting. If we say insularity, then, in a way, any sort of culture that does not allow everyone in is a culture that is bad in a way. But if you let everyone in, then you let all opinions in, and then you don't really have your culture again. So insulary in a every sense of the word can't be true. So what is true? What can we say about culture to make it negative, essentially? I guess you could say combative. You know, we, you know, it's okay to say a culture, oh, you know, you don't fit our culture yet. You know, you can come and be part of our culture. But if there's some sort of physical or, you know, force in one way or another, you know, against other cultures or individuals um, or you know, institutions, you could say, but that is relational. But then all those things are relational, aren't they? These sort of merit versus non-merit sort of looking at it. This is all talking about the way it relates to another. So definitely combative is at least a place we can start. Now, what creates a good culture? Now, that's a lot harder to see. It's a lot easier to see how things go wrong as opposed to how things go well. And in a way, within every culture, they are going well within themselves. Like even if you think jihadi, essentially, you know, when they, you know, Allah al-Akbar, kill themselves in order to, you know, do a jihad upon a sort of very violent jihad against the Western society, then they are doing what is right according to their culture. And so are constituting themselves right. And so that is interesting more to consider with the individual. That is more sort of the how the individuals feel within the culture, not how the culture is constituted in a way. You know, in a way, all those that buy into a culture are happy within it, no matter what it kind of does. And so we must figure out what is a culture in a positive way. And so we could maybe say building. You know, we want the individuals or systems that sort of not necessarily conflict, but interact or come in contact with the culture to be built up as opposed to brought down. Now, what does that mean? Built up as opposed to brought down in the same sort of situation we had before. Now that is rather subjective, isn't it? Because you know, jihadis would say that you know, they are built up to the perfect place. They get their, you know, rewards in heaven, let's say. And so that's interesting to say that you can't really say that within itself that is wrong or isn't building up, but and you know, it builds up systems within that culture and everything. So you could say that's even an integral part of culture, that it all builds things in the way of itself. And so that might provide the answer to the question. A culture that seeks the rewards of itself. Wait, is this mirrored? So I've been writing backwards all along, haven't I? According to this, haven't I? That's interesting. I wonder if I can mirror that back. As you can tell, I'm dyslexic by me not noticing that for, essentially 2.5 hours of streaming so far doing this. But 1 minute 20 here and 1 minute 10 in the other one. 1 hour. 1 hour 20 last one. This one 1:10 last one. So a culture that builds outside of itself is probably, how would you describe that? All the medical marvels of, what do you call it? Individualistic sort of spurring on from the Christian liberalism, essentially, and the scientific revolution therefrom. That is something positive that culture has brought to other things, and not really something to its own end in a way. And so with that, you could say life, liberty, in a way, life, liberty in the American way, the old American motto is sort of what the Christian model has brought, that has been instilled somewhere else to provide value. So instilling value, maybe. Now, can that still be said about the other one? Other sense of sort of destructive, both self and, I guess you could say, the system, but no. And in the constitution of itself, essentially, I wish I could say something else than jihadi, because apparently jihad is just all things that is benefit to the model of Islam, essentially. So preaching the word is jihad, apparently. But the extremist jihadi, I guess you could say, they could still say they're being instilled value, definitely, in the sort of rewards they get in heaven, and the value of that system in the system of governments is valuable to keep the way of the religion and the culture. And so instilling value is once again subjective. So in a way, we want to define some of the positives we got from the stuff that has been proven well, and build that into this definition, unfortunately. Whereas, an individual conducting himself fair or manipulative, it is easy to see that fair is the easiest way to get everyone what they want. Manipulative gets you what you want, usually at the expense of others. And, even if you manipulate yourself into someone else's will, you're not getting what you need, in a way, because you don't really know what you want. I don't know how that is. At the expense of other people getting what they want. that's quite easy to see how individuals can hurt themselves or others, whereas, or, the opposite of that, to, help all people to the most extent, the uh, bargain that benefits all is the fairest, is the best, even if it is a compromise upon what benefited the maximum benefit each wanted. Um, and this reminds me of a quote of, or the idea of, in government, there is no winning, there's just trade offs, and a lot of it. That, you know, this is a good point to bring up a point that I think is quite important to know about any sort of thing is, if we think about the supreme being, and through cultures throughout time, we can see some usual similarities, or if we see the strongest of them, which is probably most easily seen as Yahweh or God from the Bible. I'm not sure if Old Testament is as solid with this, but I'm not sure what the differences lie much in that. I think it's pretty much the same, but a lot of this is considered from building the framework of what that is. So what we can do in a sort of more secular anthropological sort of sense in this is consider the qualities considered unto that God, and compare it to all the institutions or individuals that, or culture. Well, it's interesting maybe to think about culture, but all those sort of those other things, how they compare. And well, with it being the supreme being, um, you can see how they fall short, but then it's important to know and consider that falling shortness. Like, as we talked about before with, drug systems, if it's just the government enforcing materials away from the individual, there are other ways around that government. So you could say that it's not all present, or like the God of Abrahamic religion, I think. I believe Islam pulls away that, at least. I believe in both Christianity and Judaism that that is true, that God is all present. So, or at least all seeing, he can act in all places at all times in different ways. And so it could quite easily be that God could pull material away from people and not ever allow them to do so, in a sort of capability sense. Now, why doesn't that happen? Because free will and care and love, it seems like God follows a more negative rights model as opposed to positive rights model, where, also considering that if the government cares about your well-being and safety, it would probably pull away those things as well. You know, depending if it's more preventative focused, or post healing focused, which I think is probably better. As soon as you start getting preventative, you have to start reading minds, unfortunately, or to some extent, especially with freely available systems, you start needing to go into the thing of what is it called? Is the precogs in Minority Report, that they can supposedly see the future of what's going to happen, and so then they have to go stop it before it happens. But then the situation comes up where it's like, well, was that actually what he was going to do or not? And one of the biggest things about that is the punishment of the things that were going to be done as opposed to done. And so if you're able to foresee it and stop it, has anything gone wrong? And I think it's fair to say that if you provide an action, if someone's about to do an action that is quite out of the norm or out of their intuition quite often, and that's quite often seen in with sort of blatant crimes like murder or something like that, that it would seem to me that getting caught in the act quite often is quite a shock to the person's system. Being caught about to do something would probably shock them out of it, and knowing that that would be possible and happen would probably convince them that, well, they can't get away with it next time as well, that they are not considered, they're not going to consider doing that. So that would prevent future action and the current action with. And so what is the crime committed? Is it would have to be thinking about doing it in the first place. And so I think with enough people understanding that some people, or quite a lot of people, have intrusive thoughts or that sort of thing, like the depicted urge to jump off a cliff despite they would kill you, and so if suicide is illegal, which it quite often is in a lot of places, then are you going to with how many people have those intrusive thoughts without acting on it, are you going to enforce that? Are you going to enforce the intrusive thought upon the person as a moral evil? Which I think is ridiculous. That and so with that, we have to say that thoughts cannot be punished. And also to the same extent, if you hope in a reconciliation model, if there's quite often patterns of behavior to do with some of the more fringe sort of things that would probably become illegal if you could prevent them, like and sort of there are crimes against racial, extra crime against racially motivated crimes as opposed to, or gender based discriminatory crimes as in a sort of racist or sexist way. And so if it was absolute that someone did that and was trying to reconcile for that, if you have a precognition sense of punishment, well, how do you know they're not having intrusive thoughts that violates that based on their past behavior? And they are trying to stop it and everything. They're trying to prevent themselves from thinking that way, assuming they are trying to reconcile after the conviction or whatever. That old habits die hard, as this habit says. And so are you going to essentially imprison them for life because of that, until essentially the habit of thinking in that sort of way is gone, which probably might be fair in a prison system, is that you want to hope that they aren't going to repeat the pattern of behavior, but that's a far step from thinking about having that behavior. I believe, and the same sort of thing with England essentially having thought crimes now. Someone silently praying outside an abortion clinic was, I can't remember if they were just removed from the area or whatever, but the police did actions based upon thought that this person was having in their head. And in a secular society as well, that's all you could consider that to be. That if you don't acknowledge that God exists, then prayers are just thoughts. And if you do, then it's just the wishes of that person towards that God in a way, what they wish the God to do with, if they're going to silently pray or not talk about it to people, going into the clinic or whatever, then it's just someone standing outside. Unless there's some sort of, unless you believe that God believes against that and is capable and is actioning, then there's no reason to push against it, So that's interesting to consider, unless you believe that having thoughts or wishes of your own is criminal. And so this is interesting to think about. Something down here that I'll build up into the visible part as we go. So, how do we talk about things? And this is probably important to consider with political discussion. Like there's a whole lot of political debate around, and a whole lot of the time there gets this mix-up of whether someone is talking about a preference, a mandate, or a hypothetical. So it's also interesting to consider how these fit back into here of the responsibility systems, where a preference is a maybe cultural or individual's sort of wishes without wishing upon it was high enough to be and that's interesting to consider also, high enough to be enforced legally, where you could have preference also divided into individual or cultural. So would you prefer, this is just something I would prefer, like your personal preferences. I don't, like, you could say, I was going to say I don't like strawberries, but that feels like sacrilege. That, I don't like veggies, you could say. That's not a cultural imperative you want to indict, that nobody should be wanting to have veggies, or a government system that bans veggies from the supermarket. But you could also say something like, I think I would prefer that people worked hard, maybe, or didn't slack off on their work. That would be a cultural thing. Like, I doubt that person would want that to be legally enforced. That if you caught someone slacking off, that there'd be some sort of monetary or imprisonment sentence for that. That seems not what they would be calling for. That would most certainly be a individual preference, and it's interesting to think that would build up from there in the same sort of inward destruction sort of thing. That if it is in a way the material is below the consideration of this, but if they think the government should enforce that, they probably think the culture should value that, and the individual should value that too. Maybe considering, well, obviously in the extreme cases of murder or, other sort of crimes that they think should be punished, is probably because they value that and have that as a preference and believe that should be both individual and cultural. Now, that's interesting to consider also. If we talk about cultural, we're mainly talking about the culture they are in, but like, it doesn't seem to me that they are talking about all cultures all time. Maybe if they're talking about the legal system, they might be. But a lot of people are willing to just be laissez-faire, let's say, about, well, they don't have this belief, so I won't enforce that upon them in any way, shape, or form. There's some people and somewhere else, being that case, if it, goes as high as legal, they believe that should be, all the people in their place, essentially. And so that's interesting to think. And in the way there, you get a pyramid where you have the government and all of the cultures within it, and then all the individuals, meshing in between multiple cultures, probably, if you're thinking about work culture, maybe as well, or something like that. And so then, you have many of these pyramids because, you have multiple governments. And I think that's probably a good thing. One, all people underneath one government makes there no mobility to another government. If, extreme case, your whole culture does not agree with that, they can go somewhere else without being infringed upon things that you do not believe because of all the other cultures around you don't. And it's quite easy to see that globally, many different cultures very much disagree upon various things. So, having that, if enough of them agree, let's say, a whole lot of, thinking about the Western Europe sense, there's a whole lot more people in traditional India, China, I think Brazil, maybe not, but like Russia, let's say, that would, and a whole lot of Africa that would disagree with a lot of the things that the Western world holds to be correct in, So I think if we had a global culture, it's probably more likely they would shape us than we would shape them in a sort of cultural democratic sense, in a way. If the one government was enforced by all peoples, essentially, or was influenced by all peoples, then we would probably have to give up quite a few of the privileges, rights that we have been taken for advantage that they do not believe in. So let's go back to talking about talk. So that was talking about the sort of hierarchy framework. So it's quite easy to see that if you do not have this clear, people don't know what you're talking about. Whether you really whether you think that to what extent this belief should be held. And that's quite easily to see that this is important to know. If it's just an individual belief, well, yeah, does it really matter if they does that really matter to anyone else? Can you really say yes or no? Like, unless that's, going to be infringing upon the relationships with individuals or the culture in a way. And that's sort of the relationship mark of, individual to people. Like, in a way, in certain ways, yeah, people can have their preferences. People can, getting hungry, have their individual and material preferences, in relating to others, and quite, as long as it's not violating other people's individual preferences, quite often, what's the problem? But once we move up to cultural or material culture, you could think whether that is, people think that's good, even people within that culture or maybe without. And so it's interesting to consider, should we really consider the people not in our culture when we're talking about cultural preferences? Like, fundamental religions, talking about what they think is fundamental. If they're talking to people outside, obviously they're like, no, you should not hold that. But, well, is that right? There's a saying, tradition is solutions to problems we've forgotten we have. So, that being the case, well, the culture probably might have something that's valuable, that is solving a problem that the culture had in the past and might have again if you forget about that. Now, mandate, that gets a bit more, if that's a governmental system, all the people under that should, get to weigh their opinions about what should be mandated. Now, hypothetical is sort of a weird one in this sort of framework. Where does that sit? Well, for one, when you're talking about that, you aren't even really talking about a preference. You're not talking about something that's really infringing upon anyone else, except for maybe the offense that the gross correlation is sort of having. That, if the postulation is something that is considered taboo in a sort of cultural sense, like certain comparisons between there's some spicy comparisons by certain streamers of the sort of child exploitation by labor positions and individuals, I would say, evil actions towards children. And so that is a gross hypothetical to be considering. And so you could probably object upon that, upon the standard. Also, you can object upon, usually hypotheticals are trying to prove a point, and that's quite a lot of the things I've been doing here, in a way. Well, more in this video, this stream, than the other one. Like, trying to compare government systems to the biggest kid in the playground is pretty ridiculous. Or trying to bring up the hypothetical that I believe well, let's bring it back to the things we're talking about. The hypothetical talking about if you're looking for someone to sell to help you buy a horse, you want someone not just but probably more skilled in horse rearing and stuff like that. That is a hypothetical that has a false equation built into it. And so you can object upon it on those standards. Like there are things that in a hypothetical are just blatantly infeasible and definitionally not true. Like you could say, the whole married bachelor sort of postulation towards Christians, there it's definitionally impossible. And so in a world where that was possible, those words would just mean something different in a way. And you could also say hypergamous relationships are that in a way that they are both, someone is both searching for a partner and in a marriage. So in a way, we already do have that. And yeah, so the hypothetical could pose impossibilities that, in the phrase, well, that, in that consideration is posing the limits of sort of all powerfulness of a deity. Whereas, if you brought that into a talk about relationships, like, I just want to be a married bachelor. In a way, actually, considering the other thing, we would say, yes, you probably could be that if you wanted to, and plus, we would probably understand the inference of that call. Oh, she's going into it. Oh, there we go. Anyway, the inference of what they're kind of asking for. They're looking for the freedom of bachelorness and the sort of rewards that come with being married in a way. And so I guess in that same sort of way, you could just say, yeah, sure, to that postulation. But could you really say that's possible? Well, you just also just say no into the face of it. Well, like, you can't. No, that's not something that can happen. And so, yeah, that is something interesting to consider with hypotheticals, that they sort of live in this sort of colloquial or that there's a sort of not value or virtue, but aim to them that you can object to how that relates to that. So, and in the same way with this sort of responsibility management and entity sort of model that I'm building, you could, pose some objections to that, as it is sort of a hypothetical or a framework of understanding. And that sort of frameworks of understandings are also kind of hypotheticals. But, hypotheticals can be very true. Like, well, a friend of mine was talking about how property piracy of online materials, videos, or movies is not a fair equivalence to stealing. Like, you haven't deprived the other person of that material in itself. You've deprived them of what they think they would like you to give for that. And so it is more like trespassing upon their property, that someone might require that you bring a present to a party, or that's quite an extreme case, and then the person would disagree that you're there without a present and kick you out. But you might have a business that have a door entry fee, and so someone violating past that is getting at the material without your going through your channel of getting that. And so that's quite interesting of the hypothetical case of all those anti-piracy ads in the movies back in the day. You wouldn't steal a purse is actually not a valid hypothetical, and because you're not stealing. And pointed out also with that is that you're not. It never says that you steal the movie. It says piracy is a crime. Crime what? So, and crimes are against the law or something like that. It doesn't actually say at the end that piracy is stealing. So, but they do say it is both of them are crimes. So that's an interesting, good case subject there. Now thinking about that pulls me back to this sort of model we have. And it seems as though it's a discussion, if we're talking about the responsibility part of it, where does the responsibility lie when something goes awry or violates some part of the sort of framework? It is really a discussion about the impetus of a relationship. If a individual, harms another, let's say it goes to material or, damages someone's material, that is the human's impetus upon the material. So, or the individual's impetus upon the material. So it's the individual to blame, obviously, and holds the responsibility for that action. And so that's quite interesting to think. And this is where the sort of convoluted thing we're talking about with, management of drugs is quite interesting, where ultimately we are the impetus of the Portugal model is putting it into culture in a way, or individual circumstances, and that is being neglected by the culture. And so if we say that, that is true, then that framework is how you would get at that. And if, saying that is true and it has good results kind of implies that it is the correct model. If you say, well, actually, that's not really true, is it? That's rather interesting, because under that sort of under that thought process, there's a hypothetical that you could stop all actions essentially, or stop remission of all action, reoccurrence of all actions. That if you understand the individuals and cultures, situations, and address those, you can solve any problem from ever happening again. Which, for one, doesn't stop anything from happening, because it happened the first time, and that's then you have to dig down into the impetus of that and how to fix that, for one. And two, that is supposing that that can't be undone in a way, also. So I think it's fair to say that you can't 100% stop it from happening again, and under the Portugal model, a lot of that action is still uh, accepted in a way. Um, if under that model, if they go to the board meeting and are not considered addicted or need some sort of support to get out of their situations, they are still fined or held liable for their actions. So it's interesting to consider that. And so the individual actions are still a in consideration if it is purely the decision to do so, which is still something that could be true, even under a model where you're fixing all the problems as they to stop them from occurring again. Now, if we go back, after we talk about that, finish with that thought, back to talk. Is there another way of talking? Have we exhausted that list? Also, with hypothetical, we could have idealized, or I say a lot. Idealized or integrated. Like, ideally, in a hypothetical, someone would hand me an ice cream every day and there would be no repercussions to that. But integrated into life, obviously, I would lose a lot of weight. I would gain a lot of extra sugars into my system, turn into fats, and be stored on me. Which I don't want, so I think that's a negative for me. To be PC about it. So I would not in the end call that ideal. And so in the integrated model, the hypothetical, it's not a good thing, but in the idealized, it is. So that's interesting. Now, is there another way that we can hypotheticalize? So we got ideal, integrated, and well, we could just say false. Like, hypothetically, a computer is the same as a chair. Well, I would kind of say that is sort of true. Let's say more hypothetically, a small stone is the same as a chair. It's not really true, is it? Like, you can maybe sit on a stone as you would a chair, but it is not supporting you in any way a chair would really. So, why do I say false? Now you might say a big rock is sort of the same thing as a chair because you can sit on it. Well, yeah, fair. And that was sort of my thought of a computer. Now, maybe you could say the opposite is quite a lot more easily said untrue of that first situation of a chair is a lot like a computer. No. And now that would be a good false equivalence. Now, what is the other what is the different ways of talking about mandates? Let's say. Well, we could say, well, we talked about it before, didn't we? Cultural or systematic. Well, I think there was also preference. Now, can a culture mandate things? Yes. Yes, it can. Like, let's say, well, there's a difference in actions of culture that prevents it from someone from returning to that culture versus is frowned upon. Essentially, it's something that is condemned within the culture, but not enough to isolate the person from there. So we could say cultural and system. And so with this, we get into the same sort of thing we talked about a while ago of we talked about the odd way in which the where culture sits, how it sits close to government, it quite influences government and is built out of individuals, and so is also impacted by the majority of individuals within that culture. And also influences individuals quite often. Like it is this sort of bilateral sort of influencing factor of culture is both influences people and influenced by people and influences government and it influenced government influences government and is influenced by government and so that's quite interesting. And so with that we've coming down to talking, we can see culture both has a preference and a mandate where individuals don't really. I guess you could say through rights, there's a mandate that individuals can influence, but is that just enabled by the system? Is that just a system mandate rights? And in a way it is, because it's an imperative upon the system. Both in positive rights, it's imperative upon what the system must provide, and in negative rights, it's a imperative upon what the system shouldn't provide. And so we head into this situation of really the mandate of rights is really in the system. And so it gives the freedom of the individual to, well, in a sort of way, mandate their preference. Like, if we go real base sort of existence, in a way, both sets of rights, more negative rights gives you the right freedom and life. And so with that right being provided, sort of impacting the system, that gives the ability, because they might otherwise restrict it, of the individual to act in ways that would restrict other people. So if you think about self-defense, in a sort of life or death situation, the individual, through their rights, which in negative rights sense, not being restricted by the system, are allowed to apply their preference of life, essentially, in a defensive, legal way, in a way, and also because the system is not allowed to provide any laws to restrict it. Let's say under the meta rights model as long as it's proportional, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, now that doesn't, like, I could say that, but that doesn't quite seem right, does it? That it's just your preference to survive and not a right of life. In a way, you can see that there was a difference in the way I said that. You have a right to life, and you have more people. Some people have the preference to have the ability to defend themselves, or and in sort of way that's just pre-measures, not really current measures. So that's something to consider. Yeah. So that's another question. Do individuals mandate? Now, you could, in a way, it seems a bit more ridiculous, but could be true. Just because it's new and ridiculous doesn't mean it's not true. You could say the individual acts as the arbiter of a cultural value, and so then mandates. And so that's quite an interesting concept, because if there is culture that does not value, sacrificial cultures, let's say, they do not value, if you are set out as the sacrifice of the day, then they do not value you defending yourselves in that sort of way. And so if you are brought into that culture as the victim, your preference, well, in that culture, you're not allowed to enforce your preference of life, even like saying you don't want to be sacrificed, which I would think they wouldn't, but the imperative towards the greater good does seem to influence a lot of people. So that's interesting, isn't it? That seems to say that that is true, that the individual can't mandate, and that the rights bestowed upon them give the freedom or the participation in the culture defines whether they can mandate their own protection or not, in a way, which is sort of interesting in the coming back the other way sort of model, that individuals in a culture, I guess, can enforce the mandate of I guess we can always say that individuals enforce the mandates of systems and culture. And so that being, yeah. And so we can say systems and cultural mandates are done by individuals, which is, and not just agents of those systems of culture, but also the people within it. Like a citizen's arrest is legal as long as the arrest is legal. And so that is something to consider. And so with that, we can rub off this question, I believe, that, the culture has has the mandate that each individual can defend themselves, and in a way the system does as well. And so in a way, it's still odd to say that it's your preference to do so, but it's quite easy to be preferable to your own life without really much question. But that's probably because we're in this culture, as we, talked about with the sacrificial case. So with that, it elevates the preference to something that can be utilized against individuals because of the cultural mandate, in a way. I'm not sure I like the idea of that. For one, it validates that sacrificial case of individual sacrifice. And this is where we can come into descriptive or prescriptive. And if prescriptive is a mandate, talking about a mandate, then descriptive, I don't believe, is a preference, and it isn't a hypothetical. It might even sit above hypothetical. I really need a new pen. Where you can describe both a hypothetical and something real. And in a way, a lot of hypotheticals are trying to do that. It's trying to describe the real using something that isn't. Or at least trying to describe something that could be or imaginatorily is real, in a way. So, with this construction of that, what is the virtue in culture? What is the act that we would consider virtuous? And this, once again, is still biased, isn't it? Now, if we pull that back to historically, we could say enduring. That a culture that endures both in its mandates continue to be enforced by individuals through time, that they aren't, for one, damaging themselves to oblivion, or finding it most objectionable what the culture is doing. And so that's quite an interesting thing with the anti-virtue of it. It's if we're talking about combative, it's also overreaching. That a culture that goes. Oh, okay, that's interesting. That applies its values where it's not applicable is also a negative. That is not something that you would want out of culture. You want the people buying into the culture to have the enforcement on it. So what did we say? Enduring, let's say. like suicide cults is quite easily to see a bad culture, and the proof is in that they all kill themselves and die. Yeah, that's probably maybe even a bit too spicy for YouTube to say. So a culture that lifts you up and continues and hopes to fulfill your life is a better one. Might help. So, if we're talking about description and we both have the hypothetical and the real, then I wonder if, well, we can cut out idealized because a description, and in a way these two are linked in the same way these are. That preference is sort of in the same way connected to what will happen in the same way hypothetical is. And description of the real versus mandate is essentially being pushed out into the world, or being the world. And so, in a way, you could say this is outwards and this is inwards. You maybe could get away with saying that preference and mandate is what you will go out and do in the world, versus hypothetical and real is trying to assess the world, in a way. And so, a description of the real, does it fall into the same traps? Well, I think we can definitely say there is a false. Put an A in there. There is a false. There is integrated. And probably a shallow. Like, say, for the weakest example of integrated versus shallow, we could say, so there's a couch over here that's the whiteboard's leaning up against. So one-seater, and you could say, oh, it's just something to sit on. But that is ignoring, this couch has the feature of reclining. You can pull a lever and go back. And so just saying it's a normal chair is a shallow understanding of of what it is compared to the other ones, especially. Now, you could say, this couch is a chair is equal to the one in the corner, which is also a one-seater, as compared to the one right here. But then you're ignoring the feature that this can hold 3 people. You can make a whole lot of false equivalences if you are doing shallow definitions of what is real. And that's quite interesting to consider. Now, I think this is probably me for today. I got my framework mostly done. In the top here, I've got both culture. I've got culture, material, individual, and systems as four parts that the relationships there between have a responsibility coming from one of them, and so we need to figure out how to manage the responsibility or the responsibility in those sort of actions. And so doing that, we can find some interesting things about what is the best way to conduct change, essentially, to prevent actions from happening again, or push towards what we see is better change. And so I guess quite just before we finish, we can kind of see there is sort of branches from the individual, where when we talked about the Portugal model of drug control, they really put the responsibility on the situation of the individual. And so that's quite interesting. I will go on and so that's something to consider. Now, I don't think all individuals' actions are situational. Now, if you believe in a materialistic world, well, for one, culture becomes abstract, even though we've shown that it is a lot more tied into, preference and mandate, different differentiations than, and fully integrated into governmental and individual systems and actions, then, probably you should save from something that's just a construct. Now you could say it's just another lotus points halfway between the individual and the system, and that makes it more solid than just a construct in a way. That if you want a system to run people, it seems like culture is a very valuable midpoint to influence to have the individual influence. Now, this is a part where I think maybe my consideration of the cultural impact of the Portugal model may be not true. Well, it did impact the culture quite severely in their drug use. It would be interesting to think about how the dealing got impacted by that. How, in which, what did they just crack down on dealing? Because if there wasn't any open air dealing, they did provide systems for it. Yeah. So one thing that also happened was the system, the governmental system, provided facilities for drug use in some sort of ways. I'm not quite sure exactly how, and so that had it out of that pulled it out of a culture that was forming around that of open air drug deals and in the park drug use, which you'd think would be easy to for a government to crack down on. But yeah, anyway, I guess I don't know. Anyway, so it's interesting to think that all that situation about how that fits into this model. The board that the government provided might not be cultural, but it did provide a culture of help towards the individual, because they, called the facility and organized a meeting for the individual for help, essentially. So, that seems like a very great thing. That, individuals that are struggling with either situation or addiction and the material sort of impact on them. So that's actually quite interesting, situation and addiction. Which are both, interestingly enough, is both relational as opposed to positional. Like, it's the relation between the people and their environment, or the person and the people and the substance that is being really attacked directly, as opposed to just the individual themselves, which might make the situation worse, and blah 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 blah. And so that's interesting to consider, that through that they're impacting the relation to that is causing the drug use, as opposed to just the individual themselves. So that's probably something fair to say. And so by providing avenues for help for that action, for those actions, preventing them, that is more constructive than penaltive of the person, I guess. And so it's interesting to consider that compared to the dealers, I guess you could say, where the dealers just go to crime, essentially go to court and probably prison for it, whereas an individual, I guess, because the harm is mostly in their self, that the action that is causing that harm is addressed. So that is something we should probably talk about in this sort of thing. That inward destruction, it is the relation that is impact. Relation correction. Whereas outward destruction, it is the individual. Individual is punished, which is quite nice to hear. There is a sort of balance that for one, that we haven't been doing exactly the wrong thing for all of time and punishing criminals, and two, that there is justice and the sort of wider good sort of sense, that a lot of people in the wider good feel that people should be held accountable for their actions in the sort of wider harm sense. Then that makes a lot of sense, that they still can get punishment, and that still provides good aims, but we need to not correlate the outward destructive to the inward destructive, I guess, is the important factor. And so that's quite cool. Yeah. So I'm quite happy with where we are at the moment. We've both have a new framework of or understanding of how to talk. Maybe we can add to it later, hopefully. And a structure of culture, individual, and systems. And so, the side point that we started on, it ended up being just be a relational side point, not a new locus that the situation they're in, the relationships they had with those around them, or the culture is the thing that gets treated as opposed to this other sort of thing, or their relation to the material, their addiction is also what is considered and treated as opposed to just punishment of the individual, which is quite well engineering, quite good in engineering. Now, later we might have to talk about why these aren't equivalent, because in a society that there's this sort of equivalence or removal of law justice, and it's just the wider good that we should just counsel the perpetrators and of crimes and not send them to jail or anything, which doesn't seem to be right or work with American model punishment systems aren't really doing anything to do with solving any sort of crime. Crime is booming. Yeah. Yeah, I have some notes down here of things that I wanted to get to. We have the preference versus mandate up in here in talk section, and application level. And so with that, we kind of have the cultural as well. Now, what else could I mean by application level? And also there was the idealized and stuff like that. So application level. That is pretty much sorted in the preference of individual or culture, or mandate of culture versus system. Like essentially, whether if you don't want it to happen and you want it to be mandated, do you want it to be a criminal act, or do you want it to be a cultural condemnation and isolation based upon that? Or if it's a preference level, do you want it to be just your preference, or do you want it to be the preference of the wider whole? So it's interesting that I didn't even really think about that point I had down here and solved it through my thinking. Now, there is a sort of point I had here that I only lightly touched on, and I don't think I wrote down, where I was talking about the Plato's Republic, talking about justice versus skill, that you want a skilled person, not a just person, to when you have a problem. And so the conclusion that is brought from that is that if you don't want a just person, you want a skilled person. And so justice is just something you want when not doing anything useful, which because if you want something done useful, you want the skilled person, but a just person is only useful for not even when you're talking about doing right or wrong with their sort of good for me sort of model that was being false equivalized, then when you want punishment brought upon your enemies, it's really, that's what you mean by justice, is And so what you really want is a good soldier on your side, not a just person, because you want to, provide that penalty to them, the punishment upon your enemies. And if you want niceness upon you provided, then you really want like a baker or something. You want something a nice treat as opposed to someone just who's just not very helpful. And so that's the false equivalence to skill, because really you want someone both just and skilled in those sort of areas. If you want someone, a policeman is an arbiter of, law and justice, and is supposed to be skilled athlete to provide try to enforce that. And why the good, if you're going by that model, well, maybe you don't want someone just. You want someone preferable to you. Now, there's this other point of skill not being IQ. Now, the Republic did touch on this. I believe, I can't remember. No, this is more a modern sort of understanding. Is well, yes, it does touch on this with the noble lie breeding situation. That they want to find the highest IQ person, and then they're going to be most fit. The noble king or the noble aristocracy, if there's more than them, I guess, are the ones deciding everything, and that's because their high IQ is, or whatever supposed thing of trying to define who they are, privileges them in making all decisions. It means they know best in every situation, but that is a false equivalence to skill. Like, Stephen Hawking's or Albert Einstein. Would you want them welding up a wheelchair, or do you want a welder? You want a welder. Well, unfortunately, Stephen Hawking's. But anyway, Albert Einstein, let's say. But so they have the skill or the framework of knowledge to actually be able to do that, the welder, as opposed to someone with just high IQ. Now, person with high IQ might be able to learn it faster, but this is a part of the omniscience sort of thing, where humans aren't God. They don't know all. And so if people are on different paths and different positions in that path. So, the skilled lawyer, might one day, if they tried, become a very skilled welder and be able to learn it faster than people who are currently welders. But why would you bother? Why would you wait a few years for them to learn up the skill and waste their time in keeping up their craft of lawyering, when you can just go to a welder who is very skilled in that matter and quite spent a lot of time perfecting it? And so this sort of false equivalence of IQ and skill in the noble king, in the philosopher king, that's right, really just doesn't add up. It just doesn't. Like, the philosopher king isn't all-knowing. He doesn't know all the ins and outs of different professions, and there's reasons why we do, like, in the same thing as the tradition. Tradition is solutions to problems we don't know the answer to. Now, that we've forgotten the reason for. Now, the philosopher king could maybe go back and try to figure out what those were, but what are the chances of that? All the new thinkers think their new thoughts are better than the traditional ones quite often. That's why you have a whole lot more liberal thinkers than conservative thinkers in quite wide spaces. And so with that, I forgot where I was. There's that false equivalence that person could tell you anything about why a certain practice in milking is done as opposed to another one. And them not getting hands on with the cow is never going to solve that, or help them in any sort of way. Now, this is the thing where also the philosopher king seems not to be a scientist, a engineer of sorts, someone who touches things and comes to solutions. Anyway, I think that's me finally. Coming up a quarter of a minute, 2 hours 46. That's quite nice. A good double of what my last one is. So we'll see how long my next one is. So good times. Catch you next time. Now I've quite fully done this, so unless I've figured out another aspect to each of these, or maybe probably the biggest question is in here. Was the other question solved? I put another question somewhere, didn't I? I think we've got it. Sweet. Okay, so catch you next time. I might try to think further into inward destruction and outward destruction and what sort of basis we have for treating outward destruction differently. And then also, probably a little bit more to think into positive and negative rights. And probably solidifying more into this and proofs. I should really write that down. Now, I did have a lot of I have done a lot of hypothetical talking, or maybe describing the real in some sort of ways that might be quite shallow, not really integrated in both senses. And actually, that's a good point, that idealized is also shallow. And so I probably want to get some more solid proofs in there. This is interesting that this came from a descriptive proof. And so that's actually interesting. And so that's probably under the real. Reals are proofs as opposed to hypotheticals. Okay. Almost got. I kind of want to go to the 3-hour mark now. So tau is what that is, or the symbol of tau with yin and yang. And now, I believe it was this, but I believe I was wrong about that. I remember seeing a graphic recently that kind of said the opposite. And I would like to, delve into what that really, gets at, because this is the part that gets us our sort of understanding that we should add more another, what do you call it? another antonym or anti-virtue onto each of these, because there's probably some sort of overcorrection and balance sort of situation. Now, yeah, yeah. So that's me. I hope you have a good day and night, and good week until next week. I hope this has been valuable, thought provoking sort of talk. I hope that anyone who comes up with sort of proofs in the other way or sort of objections to my comments can bring them forth in the comments, and we can explore that together. Okay, bye. See you.